A deadly incident off the coast of Cuba. Officials in Cuba say border guard troops shot and killed 4 people on a speedboat in Cuban waters who were trying to, quote, infiltrate the island nation on Wednesday. The Cuban Interior Ministry says the boat was registered in Florida and was carrying Cubans who live in the United States. One of the passengers allegedly opened fire on the border guard troops. 6 other people aboard the speedboat were wounded in the shootout and are receiving medical care while being held in custody. We've got CNN Stefano Pozzebon following the story for us. Stefano, good to see you. What do we know about this investigation? What transpired in this incident?
Well, unfortunately, we don't know much, and everything we know is directly from the Cuban government, so of course we need to take it with a little bit of caution. However, we do know that the incident took place at the northernmost tip of the Cuban coast, the part of the island of Cuba that is closest to Florida, that is closest to both Miami, the Miami community of anti-Cuban hotbed, frankly, and the Cuban Keys, which is the peninsula, that line of archipelago that drives south from the continental United States towards Cuba in South Florida. We know that 6 people have been so far apprehended by the Cuban government. The Cuban government and the Interior Ministry in particular have told us that 1 more person have been apprehended for flying into Cuba to organize the reception of what they're saying was a tripulation of terrorists. These 6 people, together with the 4 that have been killed in the standoff on Wednesday, are now accused of terrorism and trying to infiltrate the country, Cuba, in to stem a rebellion, to stem social disorder. We know that the Americans have called for a thorough investigation and for clarifying all the facts, in particular not just the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, but also the Florida Attorney General, who is appointed by the Republicans, but also the mayor of Miami, who is a Democratic politician, but still called to take everything coming out of Cuba with a pinch of salt and asking for American US investigators to clarify all the facts, especially if they link to the southern Florida community, to people in Miami, where we know that a change of government has been demanded when it comes to Cuba for more than 60 years. But this has the potential, Eleni, to rapidly escalate into the most serious geopolitical crisis of the year so far, especially after the removal of Nicolas Maduro down in Venezuela. It's a situation that we're monitoring very quickly, very closely, because it could escalate very quickly, Elena.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I want to talk about the current economic realities facing people in Cuba right now. Lifeline was always Venezuelan oil. That has dried up. I mean, you mentioned Nicolas Maduro, and of course the United States assault on Cuba as well. It's something that the US wants to focus on. So give me a sense of the mounting pressure and the humanitarian crisis that's currently unfolding there.
The mounting pressure is the strongest that the current Cuban government has faced in recent history. Cuba does not produce nearly enough of the energy that it needs, and it needs more energy, more oil to produce electricity, to run its factories, to run its city. And that's why we're seeing daily blackouts both in Havana and the rest of the island. One of the first reactions coming out of this incident, I think it's important to point out, came directly from the Kremlin, Russia being a close ally of the Castro's government and the current president of Cuba, Rubén Díaz-Canel. This is what Dmitry Peskov, the Russian spokesperson, had to say about the incident in Cuba.
The situation around Cuba, as we see, is escalating. The most important thing now is the humanitarian aspect. Of course, all humanitarian issues Cuban citizens are facing must be resolved, and no one should create obstacles.
So the United States have essentially blocked all shipments of oil from neighboring countries into Cuba. It used to be Venezuela. Maduro was removed. Venezuela is no longer sending crude oil to Cuba. It used to be Mexico. Mexico has desisted to do that after the US pressured the Mexican president. And now Canada and Mexico are sending in humanitarian aid because, of course, the humanitarian situation could as well rapidly escalate into a crisis. It's a sign, it's an arm wrestle between Washington via Miami and Havana. Of course, I say via Miami because Marco Rubio himself, the Secretary of State, is from southern Florida. He has long advocated for a regime change in Havana, and he also said that yesterday, saying that the Cuba government should seize power as quickly as possible. The Cuban situation should change as quickly as possible. And we see that increasingly isolated. PESCO, for example, did not offer any concrete help coming down from Russia to Cuba. So a situation that we're monitoring very closely in the days and weeks ahead.
Suffice it to say, it is highly unusual to see shootouts in open sea like that. It's not something that happens every day. It's something, frankly, that hasn't happened with Cuba in a very long time.
We're going to turn now to Mark Caputo. He's a White House reporter for Axios. He's done a lot of reporting on the U.S. relationship with Cuba. Thank you for being with us, Mark.
Thanks for having me.
So we heard the Secretary of State there say that they're going to want to know more. They're going to do their own investigation. And there are survivors, so to speak, right, who reportedly are in a hospital. So what can the U.S. do here?
That's a great question. What I think the U.S. is going to try to do is conduct an investigation the way the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said. And in the process of doing that, they're going to try to talk to these people. And the question we're going to have is, will Cuba participate or allow the United States to have this investigation in Cuba itself? There's a possibility, I can't assess the probability, that the answer to that is going to be no. And if the answer to that winds up being no, well, we're going to be in the middle of a real tense situation. Things are already difficult on the island. Obviously, the relationship of the United States and Cuba is incredibly hostile and has been for 67 years. The Cuban regime there, it's a totalitarian surveillance state, is really sucking wind, so to speak. That is, things are terrible on the island, in part because of the U.S. embargo and what they call a blockade, and in part because of communist mismanagement. So this is an inflection point that could become a very explosive situation, depending on how both sides handle it.
Right. You mentioned the embargo cutting off new shipments when it comes to oil. But I also, as you mentioned this, I'm thinking about the fact that Cuban intelligence hasn't been involved in places like Venezuela. You called it a surveillance state. Are we in a kind of spy versus spy situation here with the U.S. and Cuban relationship?
I mean, we have been for 67 years. The guy who made the Spy versus Spy comic was famously a Cuban, Prohias. So that is part and parcel of the United States' tense and hostile relationship with Cuba. The thing is Marco Rubio is the favorite son of the Miami Cuban exile community. And he is very much a Cuba expert, and certainly, I'm trying to choose my words carefully, a hardliner when it comes to Cuba policy. Now, he is executing Donald Trump's policy and is interested in making a deal with the Cuban regime there to transition into more of a free market, more of a free society, one where they have a free press and free elections. Those are the rules, the prongs of the U.S. embargo against Cuba. That is, we'll lift it when they become a free society. And Rubio is very much interested in enforcing that. Just how that happens, we're not quite sure, but what we do know is that this situation is sort of one of those moments where we could look back in history and say, okay, this is where a clear change is going to begin because of the way in which things unfold after this point.
It'll be interesting to learn more in the coming days. If we do, Mark Caputo, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Audie. I appreciate you.